Jonathan's introduction covered what was going to be my introduction, and it was absolutely on the mark, this sense that it's stating the obvious, but we can't do without it, space. We're extended corporeal beings. And even when we try and imagine a world without space, or heaven, or some other kind of alternative reality, spatial assumptions or metaphors almost always creep back in again. And anyway, space was part of God's good creation, and God in Christ came to share it with us. So it has a certain hallowed quality. Edward Casey writes as follows at the opening of his philosophical history of the concept of place, which we should note he subtly distinguishes from mere space, because it is space that has become humanly significant. And this, I think, has come up at a number of points in our conference so far, the distinction between space and place. He writes, "This much is true for place. We are immersed in it and could not do without it. To be at all, to exist in any way, is to be somewhere, and to be somewhere is to be in some kind of place. Place is as requisite as the air we breathe, and the ground on which we stand, the bodies we have. We are surrounded by places. We walk over and through them. We live in places, relate to others in them, die in them. Nothing we do is unplaced. How could it be otherwise?" Well, if place as humanly significant space is of primary importance to all human experience, then that will include religious experience. This does not mean that location is the defining or the most important factor in religious experiences, although it may play a significant part in the experience, but it does mean that it should be taken seriously. We may be tempted to think of ourselves as somehow preceding place, as though some disembodied I floated around before my embodiment. I don't think this is good Christian theology. And to reiterate, what requires us above all to take our corporeality, our locatedness, seriously is the fact that God became incarnate, that Christ was corporeal. Walter Brueggemann also writes about the place-space distinction, saying that place is space which has historical meanings, where some things have happened which are now remembered and which provide continuity and identity across generations. Place is space in which important words have been spoken, which have established identity, defined vocation, and envisioned destiny. Place is space in which vows have been exchanged, promises have been made, and demands have been issued. Gardens, mountains, seas, deserts, promised lands, foreign cities. You can't tell the story of God and God's people without these. Places you're sent to, places you want to get to but can't, places you're in but want to get out of, places where God promises to dwell so that you expect him to be there, places where God surprises you because you didn't expect him to be there. Now, there is, of course, a tension going on in the Old Testament, as well as the New, between place and not place, place and placelessness. The temple precipitates certain issues. Brueggemann suggests that there's a certain loss of the divine dynamism that's associated with the building of the temple. And in the Gospels, the importance of place is less easy to define. Events certainly take place in named locations, and sometimes in significant ones. The temple remains important in the New Testament. But at the same time, there's a valid case for saying that in some way the presence of God is revealed as a more distributed presence. Christ's holiness transcends the holiness of physical place. For Christians, you might argue, as a consequence of this, there is no longer a distinction between sacred and profane locations. Everything is God's creation, and Jesus' body can be anywhere. We can encounter Jesus anywhere. So the old model of sacred place is at least complicated, if not overturned, as the model of sacred place epitomized in the Temple of Jerusalem is replaced by Christ himself. And what we see as, again, a familiar tension between Protestant and Roman Catholic traditions is, in a sense, two interpretations of the meaning of the incarnation being taken in two slightly different directions. On the one hand, the idea that the body of Christ is the place where we encounter God becomes the justification for a sacramental presence in a church building where the liturgy is practiced. That is a way of, as it were, deducing from the incarnation the importance of retaining special places, built places, where we encounter God. But there is, of course, that sense, which you encounter more often in Protestant traditions, that the incarnation has made it possible for us to find Christ anywhere. And my own tradition, which is Anglican, tends to think in terms of God being everywhere in particular. It's not exclusively Anglican, but I like that idea that God is everywhere in particular, wanting it both ways as usual. Anglicans always want it both ways. It believes in a strong doctrine of presence, special presence in the sacraments, for example, but it's quite generous in how it sees this special presence distributed in many localities. Now, when we imagine ourselves back into medieval or Renaissance times, we actually have to work quite hard to remember that a clear distinction between sacred and profane doesn't apply there in the same way that it does for many of us moderns, where we have a clearer sense of the secular as a distinct realm to which the sacred is either marginal or has to bid for a certain kind of visibility. That isn't true in the landscape of the sacred, which is typical certainly in medieval and Renaissance Europe, a landscape where for example, pilgrimage routes map the territory. They're connected to one another by veins of sacred force, where people see not only special places, but all the interconnections between them as being somehow held together in a world of sacredness. And in Italian cities, to take Italian cities as a particularly attractive example, in Italian cities we see it's difficult to draw an absolute distinction between the sacred and the profane world around it. Holy images spill out from the churches. They're present everywhere. You meet them on the street corners. Florence, Rome, Venice, these are cities populated by statues, all of whom look down at one, and most of which are Christian in character. Public spaces are used for liturgy. Piazzas, streets are used for celebrating, extending the divine mysteries into the life of the polis, of the city. And in various ways, perhaps less fulsomely and some ways less attractively, other cities, including my own, London, have done their best to think of themselves as sacred, as cities, not just having sacred places within them, but as sacred cities, New Jerusalems in different ways. And we heard about in Roberta's talk yesterday about how many cities have aspired to that. London in its own way did that when, after the Great Fire of London, Nicholas Hawksmoor, one of the pupils of Christopher Wren, who of course built St. Paul's Cathedral, Hawksmoor built one of his small and rather select group of city churches, all of which are amazing architecturally, and one of which was St. Mary Woolnoth, which is right in the heart of the old city of London, the commercial district. T.S. Eliot refers to St. Mary Woolnoth in his poem The Wasteland. And he had a limited space in which to do it, but his pretensions were enormous, which was to give London its own temple. And so if you go into St. Mary Woolnoth and look either side of the communion table, you'll see these pillars. It's not very clear in this slide, but the pillars are built in a sort of barley sugar swirl effect, which Hawksmoor believed was what the pillars would have looked like in the temple at Jerusalem. So he's deliberately evoking the temple at Jerusalem at the heart of London, again, to claim London as a city, a sacred city. Well, that was a rather long preamble, and I now want to summarize what my main claims are going to be in the rest of this talk. And they have to do with how something has gone wrong since the medieval and Renaissance era I've just been talking about. And this something is closely bound up in the shifts in philosophical thinking, both about religion and about aesthetics, that are going on in the 17th century. And they have a profound effect on the way that we moderns relate to space. To put it very baldly indeed, a sort of warfare is introduced between human beings and the spaces that they inhabit. The world becomes constructed as a kind of place, as a place in which human beings are no longer at home. A Christian celebration of space as infused with God's goodness and activity, and as our God-given natural milieu, loses its purchase on the modern imagination. It seems that there can only be two outcomes. In one, we win over space. In another, space wins over us. And the arts play their part in endorsing and reinforcing this depressing outlook by accepting a new opposition between the beautiful and the sublime. Again, Roberta set this up wonderfully yesterday, in which the latter, the sublime, is exalted as profound but dangerous, and the former, the beautiful, is set up as pleasing but superficial. The sublime is considered the more real, the beautiful a comforting illusion. The sublime is space running riot, so that the human form is minimized or obliterated by it. The sublime gestures to a space we cannot contain. The beautiful seems trivial as a consequence. Here's an image by the Victorian painter, English painter, G.F. Watts, hugely popular in Victorian England, rather neglected today. He was regarded as a kind of artistic prophet in Victorian England. People revered him, and he dressed accordingly, making himself look sort of almost like a quasi-clergyman. He had robes that were sort of priestly robes, even though he wasn't one. And this is an example of a work. It's a biblical scene. As he imagines it, it's the scene just after the waters of the flood begin to recede. And yet it's almost abstract. A lot of people see this image as what's anticipating the rise of modern abstraction. And it's a sublime image in a certain sense. It's about this vast, all-encompassing, transcendent, but devoid of human figures reality. So I'm being very broad brush about this, but I want the claim that I'm making to be vivid. I'm going to illustrate it a little bit, and then at the end I want to make some suggestions of how a Christian tradition of art can and should be looked to for a more mediated, a more affirmative vision of how we and the spaces that we live in are related to one another and should relate to one another under God, while still preserving one important thing that the sublime does, in its way, keep in play. That's to say, the radical otherness and transcendence of God. My point will be that God's transcendence can be safeguarded and honored without a necessary opposition being set up between significant form, the human scale, the idea of beauty, and the idea of a sublime that overwhelms us. So, this section is called We've Got to Get Space Before Space Gets Us. As so often, Kant crystallizes the problem. There are two aspects of his legacy that I want to highlight here. First, he opposes the infinite to the finite, with the correlate that the sublime, which is the art of infinity, you might say, is made the opposite of the beautiful, which is the art of proportion and finitude, rather than being seen as compatible aesthetic partners to one another. Burke, of course, Edmund Burke, did his own version of this already. So that's Kant's first move. He opposes the infinite to the finite. But second, he celebrates the power of human reason to stand above this opposition, retaining a sort of mastery, even of sublime experience. The viewer of sublime spectacle, if strong enough in his or her reason, comes away with a strengthened view of the powers of the rational mind and can display this mastery in works of art that show infinite sublime space being subdued by rational oversight. This image by Caspar David Friedrich captures, I don't know how deliberately, but captures that Kantian sense that our reason, this human figure represents for me the figure of Enlightenment reason, capable of looking at a sublime landscape, mountainous, vast, receding into a distance that we cannot get the measure of, and yet somehow over it, able to survey it confidently. So for Kant, one's inability to grasp the enormity of a sublime event, such as an earthquake or an avalanche, or of a natural reality, like a mountain or an ocean, our inability to grasp the enormity of that demonstrates the inadequacy of our sensibility and imagination, but simultaneously, we have an ability, subsequently, to identify such an event in our reason as singular and whole, as infinite, to think the idea of the infinite with our reason. And this, for him, indicates the superiority of what he calls our supersensible faculty. A supersensible faculty. Our sensibility might be overwhelmed. Our senses might be overwhelmed, but our reason has a supersensible faculty which can think about the experience. And this enables us to encounter a sublime object which might create feelings of fearfulness in us without, as he puts it, without our being afraid of it. For Kant, the sublime thus reveals our superiority over nature. It displays our mind's power over sense. It enables us to appreciate our autonomy. We simultaneously see our physical selves as subject to the overwhelming power of nature, and our rational selves as independent of it. Two contradictory tendencies are thus displayed. In one direction, nature's awe threatens to overwhelm us. In the other direction, the transformation of fear into delight seems to reveal our autonomous superiority. Now, Kant may have thought that he'd found a way to keep these two contradictory tendencies in play simultaneously. But in practice, they've tended to fuel the view that if we don't master sublime space first, it will conquer us. Artistic efforts in the first direction are largely classicizing and rationalist. Nietzsche would have called them Apollonian. That's the idea that we have to conquer space first. Artistic efforts in the other direction are what Nietzsche would call Dionysian. And the spirit of contemporary art, it's worth noting as we pass, is predominantly a Dionysian one. Dan Hardy, an adopted Brit, American by birth, who died recently, an Anglican theologian, delivered a lecture at the University of Virginia in 2004. He'd stood there whilst at Thomas Jefferson's Rotunda, which you see behind me, which is, for many people, the symbol of UVA. I've never been myself, but I have it on good authority from people who live and work there, that it's a symbol for UVA, the defining mark of Jefferson's architecture for the school. And the view from the Rotunda, the northern head of the main campus, looks south over what's called the lawn, with elegant brick buildings to left and right. And what you would have seen straight ahead of you, when those apartment buildings stopped, was initially an unenclosed wilderness beyond. That's, as it were, looking in reverse, northwards towards the Rotunda bit. You can see how it would have been open at the southern end. You would have seen wild space, sublime space, perhaps, untamed nature. Since then, the pressure for more facilities has caused the southern view to be closed off, so that now instead of open forests, you see an auditorium and a large classroom building. And Dan Hardy, I leave it to you to decide whether this is fair or not, but I'm interested in his interpretation of it, whether or not it's true. For Hardy, there was something significant, he felt, to be discerned about a rationalist imperative, both in the original vision, which you see here, and in the later cutoff. It symbolized for him an important aspect of a rationalist understanding of the human being's place in God's creation. For Jefferson, he said, reason is a human construct informed by a priori principles inherent in our being or nature. This means that the other nature that we find out there is ultimately unknown, maybe even threatening. Nature is beautiful, to be sure, but also sublime and dangerous. It can be cognized only to the degree that it is domesticated, and it's domesticated only by human rationality. And then he went on to suggest that this initial way of thinking about nature as other already contained within itself the seeds of the next stage of architectural activity, the closing off of the south side, so as to enclose the lawn. Whatever the practical reasons may have been for doing it, this too, he felt, symbolized an ongoing failure of vision. Jefferson's Enlightenment standard of rationality could be read as reflecting a distrust of the unknowable in nature. Nature is acceptable only when it accommodates our rational constructs. When nature displays its fury, we would judge it irrational and close it off, limiting reason's gaze to what lies within our precincts. And whether or not it's true of Virginia, it's certainly true of many examples of European gardens, some of which we had glimpses of yesterday, Versailles, for example. This imposition of a human rational order upon natural realities, non-human natural realities. So this is one half of the Kantian tension. We can prove ourselves independent of nature and dominate wild spaces by the exercise of our rational nature. But the other side of that Kantian legacy is that we feel ourselves potentially at the mercy of them. Here's Turner's magnificent painting of Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. The human figures not quite obliterated and nonetheless tiny and severely under threat, at risk of being occluded, overwhelmed, destroyed, literally killed by nature. The rise of the sublime parallels the event of modernity within philosophy, in which God and nature are likewise divorced. God, too, is divorced from nature, as well as we. And God and nature, too, set in mutually exclusive opposition to one another. Nature, the world of beings, is transcended by God in a way that really means that God is absent from it, veiled and impenetrable. God's transcendence can now only be understood, it seems, as God's exile beyond the world, occasionally breaking through, perhaps, but only as some sort of alien force. And postmodern thought, in various ways, continues to exalt the unrepresentable in direct continuity. Sorry, that's the wrong direction. In direct continuity with this modern trajectory, as though the utterly unrepresentable is being at its truest and most untrammeled, being known precisely through its enmity towards the fragile, frozen present of representation, known at the points when representation, whether conceptual or artistic, is ruptured or dissolved. I made a program for BBC Radio a few months ago on the idea of beauty, and Tim Marlowe, who's the curator of White Cube, one of the trendiest galleries in London, in fact has 3 locations in London now, agreed to talk with me about whether the language of beauty is applicable in any sense still in contemporary art. And at that time they were showing an exhibition by the Indian artist Rakib Shaw. You can see a detail from one of Shaw's works here. And what Tim Marlowe wanted to persuade me was that there is still beauty in contemporary art, it's just not what it's all about. So we went and looked, and the images were stunning. I loved seeing them. Some of them are truly extraordinary. He works with these almost lacquered surfaces, very, very colourful, often decorated with jewels or at least fake jewels, which give them this sparkling surface effect. And he explores questions of what it is to be in exile in the world, not so much at home as in exile. So the exhibition we were looking at together was called Paradise Lost. The work was full of a sense of longing, but also of deferral. The art was vivid, it was immense, and full of an intensity that I think derives from its hovering between nostalgia for the past, tentative hope for the future, and the ever-present fear that at the root of life there is only entropy. The longing for home is part of the art's beauty, and I like that, and its visual forms are a dance of connectedness, very beautiful, at least in formal terms, very beautiful dance of connectedness. A lot of the connectedness, when you look more closely, you don't see it initially, and I think this is part of how the art works. You get close to it, drawn by its superficial beauty. You start to realize that a lot of the connectedness is savage, very often taking the form of mutual consumption or sexual predation. Wild animals appear a lot in these images and eat one another or prey upon one another in sexual ways. That's part of how the works surprise us and make us think. Are these the deepest forms of participation there are? Are these the deepest forms of connection there are in our world? Sex and eating. Ought we to look for more? These are good questions to raise, and I think, probably intentionally, I was disturbed by the sorts of connection being shown, but there was a disconnect far more disturbing to me than just the ones on the surface, and that was the disconnect between the surface and the depth. The surface connections were intensive, but they seemed to float upon the surface of an infinite deep, like a sky or an ocean. It was magnificent but impassive. It was sublime. The forms that floated on the surface may have been violently or bestially connected, but at least they were connected. The one connection that wasn't made was the connection between surface and depth, between beautiful form and sublime hinterland, between creation and creation's source. If the surface patterns mean nothing, their formal beauty merely taunts us or tortures us. It may be that the only kind of beauty we feel we can honestly own in our uncertain day is this sort of superficial beauty, but that's a painful conclusion to reach. And I wonder whether, in those circumstances, it really merits the name beauty. I was going to quote David Bentley Hart. I'm not, because it's a very long quotation and he's a very wordy man. But some of the ideas in the background of this, and some of you may recognize, are very much in line with David Bentley Hart's discussions in his book, The Beauty of the Infinite, which I recommend you to read. It's a very stimulating book. A concern with the spiritual and an expectation that this spiritual reality will be found at the edges of life, in confrontation with world enigmas or boundless space, is a dominant assumption in contemporary thought and art. And such instincts are precisely not friendly to traditional Christian theological ways of putting things. If we accept that sublime art is concerned aesthetically to evoke conceptual ideas of infinity in a distinctively modern vein, then we may conclude that it's not equipped to open any particularly privileged way to an appreciation of the divine glory, at least in traditional Christian terms. Because the divine glory is not simply an impassive infinite. Like philosophy's fascination with alterity, otherness, or phenomenologies with limit experiences of various kinds, we may say that the art of the sublime will show itself inadequate for approaching the question of the transcendence of God, of the Christian God, for that is a different kind of transcendence. Christians claim God can be apprehended in some way in the midst of creaturely reality. It just won't be the way of the sublime, narrowly or exclusively conceived as the not beautiful. So what alternative is there, if any? The answer would, I think, be a surprising one, and perhaps an unwelcome one, to many moderns. It is the incarnational turn to the body, and with it to the particularity of persons, that opens for a Christian tradition of art its best possible chance at transcendence. The body cannot ever leave center stage for a Christian art. The art of the embodied Christ does not, of course, capture or describe God's transcendence. Rather, it relinquishes its desire to realize God's transcendence as a human idea or image and prepares itself to receive the unsettling intuition in faith that God is beyond any artificial border that we may set up between what is interior to the world and exterior to it, placing God conveniently exterior, outside. There's nothing in relation to which God is outside or beyond. God is not contained within the created order, but nor is God in his transcendence outside it. And the surpassingness of God's transcendence is in no way the surpassingness we sense when we feel the limits of our powers of sense perception and rational apprehension, our cognitive powers. And yet to address ourselves to the body or the face or the words of Christ, as artists and writers have encouraged us to do in countless ways, is to do something different. Ecce homo, behold the man, is their proper invitation to ask the question, who are you, of Christ? As Dietrich Bonhoeffer has insisted, this is the only genuine way to approach the transcendence of God, rather than the transcendence of limit experiences or limit thoughts. Or, to put it another way, it's to encounter a limit at the center of life and not at its edges. To encounter a someone, one who resists our possessive appropriation and yet is wholly embodied and real and historical. Bonhoeffer writes, behold, God become human, the unfathomable mystery of the love of God for the world. God loves human beings. God loves the world. Not an ideal human being, but human beings as they are. Not an ideal world, but the real world. What we find repulsive in their opposition to God, what we shrink back from with pain and hostility, namely real human beings, the real world, this is for God the ground of unfathomable love. It is not enough to say that God embraces human beings, for this affirmation rests on an infinitely deeper one, namely that God, in the conception and birth of Jesus Christ, has taken on humanity bodily. A couple of years ago, I was put into a public dialogue in King's with a colleague who I'd never met before from the Department of War Studies, and she was not a religious person in any way, and she kicked off. But what she said immediately resonated with me because she was talking about the shock and awe tactics used in the bombarding of Iraq as a sublime event, as it were, an enactment of a certain sublime aesthetic through warfare. It's a very dramatic presentation. The shock and awe tactics celebrated by their perpetrators in the invasion of Iraq were not simply aimed at achieving a military objective, or a narrowly military objective. They were a form of spectacle, performed for a global public gaze. It was a display of overwhelming power, the immediate target of which was not just the population of the city, or indeed of the country, but a whole political region, indeed the global population as a whole. The strategy of shock and awe, she argued, was devised by its strategists based on the assumption that the unleashing of firepower so overwhelming in its intensity and frequency would compel the enemy into almost immediate surrender. It was excessive. War had become spectacle. And then she said, what's lost when war becomes spectacle is that experience and its materiality in the body are somehow lost from view. And she claimed that the job of the artist faced with this, and she gave examples, the job of the artist was to place the body back center stage, to show what shock and awe does to bodies, and that the artists can do that, and as it were, desublimate was her language, desublimate the shock and awe by a return to the body. And that makes perfect sense to a Christian. That made perfect sense to me. Except, she thought you had to get rid of everything to do with the sublime in order to retain the body at center stage. And that was the point at which I thought there was some Christian corrective to be made from the other side. And that's where I want to finish. Because for her, if you bring the body back, you lose the glory, or the sublime. Glory, I'm assuming, is the Christian version of sublimity. And it's not opposed to the body. She thought you had to choose. And I found myself wanting to show her and the audience this icon. Because in this icon, the Transfiguration and all those like it, and I think in a sense that the icon of the Transfiguration is quintessentially what all Christian art is about. It's about revealing the glory of God through materiality, through bodies. All Christian art, in some sense, is depicting transfiguration. This image shows that you can have glory, Christian sublimity, not taking the place of human bodies, finite human bodies, but precisely radiating out from them. There is a co-inherence of the two, an appropriateness of the two, a fittingness between the two in Christ. So in finishing, I want to call for a return of the language of beauty premised upon a confidence, a Christian confidence, that the sublime and the beautiful need not be opposed, that the body is perfectly compatible with a celebration of the glory of God. My argument has been that fundamental to a Christian treatment of space in art, which includes the treatment of the bodies that inhabit space, fundamental to that treatment is the experience and the expectation of communion, of a mysterious sharing and bonding between created things, a participatory beauty, the beauty of things connected, relating, displaying their at-homeness with each other, all sharing in a hymn of praise in which there is both light and shadow, abstraction and figuration, depth and surface. Each particular thing in our environment can be wonderfully individuated, but also fully related to all the others. And their being fully individual and related in this way can be acknowledged in acts of aesthetic unification, which refer them all to God, their deep source, not like Rakib Shaw's impassive deep, but a deep here that is a good deep, a trustworthy deep, a deep that loves the individual forms whose being it supports, and that wants to preserve such forms in all their diversity within the generous space that he has provided for them. Thank you very much.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.